All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, Building Culturally Competent Coalitions. This webinar is brought to you by the National Center for Victims of Crime in partnership with the Identity Theft Resource Center, and it's been put together as part of the National Identity Theft Victim Assistance Network program, which is funded by the Office for Victims of Crime. My name is Laura Cook. I'm the Director of Training and Technical Assistance with the National Center, and I've been working with the NITVAN program for the past year. Today, in part 2 of the webinar series, we're going to be focusing on member engagement and growing the coalition. Like in part 1, the webinar is going to be focused on some broad discussion questions, so we'll be using Poll Everywhere to get input from all of you. Our presenters will explain the process for responding at the start of the presentation. And before we get started, I'd like to briefly introduce them. Muro is the Economic Justice Policy Coordinator for the Texas Council on Family Violence, TCFV. Mona joined TCFV after working in the family violence and sexual assault field for 9 years, where she provided direct victim advocacy to survivors. In her position at TCFV, she provides consultation and technical assistance on economic empowerment policies and practices which enhance safety opportunities for survivors. Ms. Muro received her undergraduate degree from the University of Texas at Austin and master's in social work degree from the University of Texas at Arlington. And Berneta Haynes is currently the Senior Director of Policy and Access at Georgia Watch, where she works to make quality healthcare, financial literacy, energy programs, and civil justice more equitable and accessible for all. An attorney and champion of equity and justice, Berneta brings a unique mix of legal advocacy work, writing expertise, and innovative use of digital journalism to impact pressing consumer issues. Berneta received a JD from the University of Iowa College of Law, a BA in English, Psychology, and Writing from Drury University, and a master's in English from the University of Iowa. Her interest in equity and justice stems from her liberal arts background and research around intersections of race, class, and gender in American culture. And with that, I will turn it over to Berneta and Mona.
Thanks, Laura. Let me take a quick moment just to introduce the software that we'll be using today for our conversation. As Laura mentioned, we are using the Poll Everywhere software. If you're on the web link, you will see in front of you the directions to join. You can launch by going to another web browser and popping in www.pollev.com/TCFV, and that will populate the web platform for Poll Everywhere that we're going to be using for our responses today and for your contributions. You can also use your cell phone if you'd like, and you can open up a text message. In the number, go ahead and put 22333, and then in your content, your message, type in the letters T as in Texas, C as in council, F as in family, V as in violence, and send that off. And again, that'll get you connected to our web platform for today. This will be up for just a moment, but it will also be at the top of the screen. So if you join us, or maybe you get kicked out of the Poll Everywhere, the directions will be at the top of every single question that we'll be asking. And again, we really want this to be an opportunity for folks to contribute and make this interactive and hear everybody's voices. And so if you can engage with us through the platform, we'll be reading people's responses and identifying any trends that we're seeing. And we want this, again, to be a peer sharing opportunity for us to learn from each other and for us to share information with each other. So with that, I will turn that over to Berneta.
Thank you, Mona. I'm happy that everyone can join us again. For those of us who joined us on Monday, for newcomers, welcome, and we hope that this ends up being a very engaging conversation. So I want to start out with this first question that you should see on your screen in front of you. Just getting a sense of who's on the call today. So enter that into Poll EV, your name, role, and organization. So far we have Jerry Mares from New Mexico's Office of the Attorney General, Policy Analyst. Melissa Schultz from Texas OAG Child Support Division, okay. Desiree from the U.S. Attorney's Office. Marissa from Victims for Justice. All right, we got YWCA Kalamazoo, Mallory. Okay, and Leon in Pittsburgh. So we got an interesting spread here geographically as well as types of organizations and agencies. The Lancaster Bureau of Police, great, a police social worker, Lilani. Hopefully I pronounced your name right, Lilani. Courtney at the Wisconsin Department of Justice. So a really nice spread here. Awesome to have everybody here with us. Okay, so let's move on to our discussion and get into the meat of things. So, first of all, one more little bit of background information on people on the call, because this is something that's really important that we all sort of take into the coalition work that we do. And that is, what community do you identify as being part of? We asked this question in the beginning of the first call, and I just want to make sure that we're still grounding ourselves in this question and understanding how our specific background really does inform how we approach coalition work. So what communities do you identify as being part of personally? And how does that show up in your coalition work? All right, we have ethnic, immigrant, victims of domestic violence. Right. And this is not just in terms of the communities that you're representing, but even you personally, the community that you identify with. All right. And I will just, and I see again, immigrant, victims of crime, ethnic. Great. And I will just reiterate something that I made a point to lay out in the first call, which is that obviously, as you can see, I identify as African American, but I also identify as working class because, well, I identify as coming from a working class background, now middle class, as a woman, and also as a queer person, and how all of that plays a role into my coalition work I'm very cognizant of on a regular basis. And so we want to start out with this question because we want you to constantly, or at least periodically, think about what you're actually bringing to the work, any sort of baggage, any sort of preconceived notions, any kind of trust that necessarily you might be bringing to the coalition that you automatically have based on your identity in these particular categories. So all women, children, men, ethnic. All right. So we won't belabor this question. We'll move on and get into the meat of our discussion. All right. I like that last comment. I work with all of the above. I do not identify within these groups, which can be a barrier when giving services to victims. That is a really nice segue into our discussion. Mona?
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you everybody for pulling in your response. I did briefly see a chat message come in, but I was not able to read that. So if at some point we do want to read that, please let us know. With respect to how we're approaching the work, and one of the reasons why we started off with, asking about how folks identify and what communities they're coming from is because, as Berneta said, we are grounding the work that we're talking about when we're engaging communities of colors and marginalized and underrepresented folks. We all come to the work with something, with our lived experiences. I myself identify as a Latina that grew up in a predominantly Hispanic and Latino area, very disadvantaged socioeconomically, and so poverty was an underlying factor, and all those things influence the way that I approach the work that I do, as well as how I engage with other folks, specifically in underrepresented and marginalized communities. It makes my vantage point be much more attuned to the barriers and challenges that folks come to the work with. And so I wanted to just give a brief background of the organization that I work with, as well as the perspective I'm coming to this conversation with. I myself work with the Texas Council on Family Violence, as Laura mentioned earlier. We are a statewide domestic violence coalition that essentially is a kind of an umbrella organization for close to 100 domestic violence programs across Texas. We also have members that are broader stakeholders, as well as obviously survivors as well that are part of our membership. And so I work on our policy team here at TCFE and work specifically on economic justice and racial equity issues. And so those are the overarching umbrellas that I come to the work with. The other piece that I am coming to this conversation today from is as a partner at the Texas Coalition Against, the Texas Coalition on Coerced Debt, or as we refer to it as the TCCD. The TCCD is actually a NITVAN grantee that received some support and some funding to move forward with our coerced debt work. And that's specifically looking at the intersection of identity theft and financial abuse and for domestic violence survivors. And so it's a very unique intersection that we are talking about with respect to this work. And so TCFE, the membership organization that I'm a part of, is a partner organization alongside 3 other organizations: Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid, Texas Legal Services Center, and Texas Appleseed, all organizations in Texas that support the work of the TCCD broader. So there's 4 kind of primary stakeholders that have been able to move this coalition forward. So I wanted to just give folks a bit of a background from the perspective that I'm coming to this work with. And kind of inform, because that informs the conversation here today. And that informs the work that I come with as a statewide, and then also as a partner organization alongside 4 other organizations trying to create a coalition. So wanted to also open the conversation with respect to what have you guys done, the folks that are on the call today, to engage and grow traditionally underrepresented and marginalized members within your coalitions. So that's a pretty kind of specific question, and it's the intersection of what we're looking at, right? We're really looking at how are we actively and proactively and intentionally engaging folks who have come to this work largely in an inequitable manner. And so they may not be coming with the same resources. We may not be engaging with communities who have the same experience. And so how are we actively and proactively trying to engage and grow folks from these communities? It looks like we've got some, I've not done much engagement and growing members in the coalition. I'm hoping this webinar can provide some suggestions. Our mission is to eliminate racism, and I sit on a racial justice collective, and we host racial justice caucuses every month, as well as I provide one. Wonderful. I'm inexperienced as well. And so it looks like folks are coming to this with some involvement, but also with very little to no engagement or experience with that. And we definitely expect that folks have varying degrees of experience with this. And it's one of the reasons why we're hosting the conversation today, right? And really talking about the need for this particular initiative. And so some of the things that we have done here at TCFE, as well as a part of the TCCD, is to really look at some of these intersections and to proactively, again, look at these specific pieces. So when we're thinking about this, there's a couple of pieces that I would kind of put at the forefront of the conversation. At the TCCD, again, that's the Texas Coalition on Coerced Debt, there is really an overarching goal to be inclusive, to be representative, and to be equitable in our membership. And so we are really proactively thinking about some of these pieces. One of the really positive things that I'll share really quickly is that we recently added a inclusivity statement to our engagement emails. When folks are interested in being a part of the TCCD, we have a very clear, proactive, inclusive statement that's essentially saying that diversity and representation is what flourishes, and that makes our community flourish, And so we actively seek to prioritize and value representation from people from all communities. And specifically, we're engaging folks that are folks of color, people who identify as LGBTQ+ or gender nonconforming, individuals with disabilities, as well as folks who speak a language other than or in addition to English. And so as we proactively engage folks, we are really wanting to say outwardly, this is a priority for our coalition, and so that folks can see this externally, that they are proactively wanted and welcome into this community. And I will turn that over to Berneta.
All right. I said next slide. Move on. Keep our discussion rolling here. All right. So in any coalition work, you're always going to face challenges. And really, in a lot of ways, the key to handling those challenges is being able to anticipate them, but also being able to adapt to the surprise challenges when they occur. So I would love to hear from folks around the webinar on, what challenges have you anticipated facing or have you faced in your engagement and growth efforts with underrepresented and marginalized communities, whether it's just getting folks to actually involve themselves in the coalition or whatever. So what are some of the challenges you face? Lack of resources in rural areas. And I wonder if that's lack of resources in terms of, I wonder if the person who posted that would drop in the chat box a little bit more to elaborate by what they mean in terms of lack of resources in rural areas, because I have a sense. I know in our rural areas, just getting to our rural areas can be a little bit of a challenge. So really sort of getting rural folks involved in coalitions can be quite a bit of a challenge just getting there. They really do lack organizations in large part. So you're kind of working with very little in terms of a demographic that's already plugged in. I see here lack of access to services for clients, so we try to do more research, do more outreach. Leadership buy-in is a big deal. I like this comment here. I anticipate community members being apprehensive in whether or not their participation will make a difference. I will say that getting people to understand the purpose goes a long way towards helping people understand whether or not participating for them will make a difference. So really this boils down to having a good, strong sense of what your purpose is and being able to actually convey that. Because otherwise folks will say, okay, but we're on these calls every other month. What does it matter? What's the end goal? And I see here, it looks Jerry provided extra detail in terms of the lack of resources in rural areas. A lack of resources includes infrastructure, technology, people. Rural Wi-Fi access is everything in terms of the challenges we face here in Georgia, being able to get people plugged in. So we're always trying to do a lot of social media engagement with our coalition. And when you're working with rural coalition partners who are dealing with a demographic that doesn't have the greatest access to Wi-Fi, you're bumping up against the question of, well, what's the purpose of social media advocacy for us? Like, this is not going to affect anybody in my community. So yeah, so I see, definitely. So I want to, I would love to hear a little bit more about the lack of trust clients have with agencies. One of the things that I guess was probably the impetus for these webinars was a conversation I was having with Laura back in May during the training. And I said, how do we plug in marginalized communities, particularly African Americans, in this work that has to include, it has to involve the police force and police officers, because they're really the folks we're going to have to depend on to enforce the laws in this space and to actually protect folks. But when we have a sort of distrust between these two communities, how do we make sure that we're involving marginalized communities in this coalition work? And also making sure we have police officers at the table because they're so instrumental in protecting folks. That was really part of the impetus for this webinar, if I'm not mistaken. So I really appreciate that comment. So I won't belabor this too much because I want to be very conscious of time. I want us to have a lot of time to discuss. So I would say this last comment here, and then we'll move on. Representation matters when providing services to clients. Absolutely, and that ties in with also service providers not unpacking their own biases can hurt clients.
And I want to add to the quick conversation about some of the points that you just made Berneta, about engaging specifically with African American communities and the barriers and challenges that have happened and that Georgia has experienced. Some of the things that we're seeing in Texas are kind of similarly positioned with respect to our immigrant and undocumented communities here. And so we have a lot of real hesitation to engage with law enforcement in that similar way. It's specifically because there is a concern, a very well-founded concern that when engagement with law enforcement, there is a fear that they will also communicate with ICE. And that's Immigration and Customs Enforcement related to removal and deportation. And so it's a chilling effect that we've seen and experienced a lot in Texas. And so at the TCCD, it's something we've been having conversations around with respect to how do we open up other opportunities for our folks who are in our immigrant communities that identify within that community to access remedies that are not just solely related to law enforcement interaction. And that's a challenge point. It's going to continue to be a challenge point, but I wanted to just make that, the similar concern from different populations, marginalized and historically oppressed communities.
Yeah, and I'll just underscore that it's always important to acknowledge and to hear that these are definitely well-founded concerns. And then it's just a matter of figuring out, okay, what is the best environment? Because we always want our coalitions to be safe spaces for any of the members participating. So what's the best way to make sure that folks feel safe actually participating in those spaces and actually feel like not only safe, but that maybe they can help do some of the work of dispelling some of this distrust as well. So in my experience here in Georgia, really sort of getting people over that hump, getting past that particular trust barrier serves a lot of purposes. It not only makes it easier for law enforcement to do their work of protecting folks in this space, but it also enables community members to help law enforcement do their, actually know when to report and not fear reporting and things of that nature. So it makes all this work easier if you can sort of figure out how to overcome that trust barrier within your coalitions. So yeah.
Absolutely.
We'll move on from that. And I'll turn it back over to you, Mona.
Let's see if our PowerPoint wants to work for us right here. Oops. There we go. Sorry about that. So tell us about initiatives that you've taken or will take, or any ideas that you might have for the folks who are coming to the conversation to really learn and hear. Maybe you've got some ideas that have been percolating. Tell us about those with respect to maintaining and sustaining membership of traditionally underrepresented or marginalized communities. So we're really looking at this point, ideas for sustainability and maintenance. So once those folks have come to the table, once they are a part of your coalition, what are we doing around keeping people there? And to the person's point earlier, that they feel like their voice and their input and their participation is being valued. So what are you doing and or have done? Or for folks who maybe have not engaged yet in this platform, what are some ideas that you think might work? I think one of the things that I would go ahead and lead with too is that we want to come to this work with a level of humility and vulnerability because what we're doing with this work is really collaborative, right? And we want to be engaging folks and creating space that are, again, representative, that are inclusive, and that are equitable. And so we do want to be mindful, but we also in some ways need to be able to feel safe to take risks. And so ideas need to be thrown out there to see what works, right? Like we have to move forward with trying and attempting in order to see if we're able to effectively really sustain our communities and this representation, our coalition building. I think one of the things that I'll share is that with respect to initiatives is that I worked outside of the TCCD on a racial equity project that, in which we really looked at serving domestic violence advocates of color and things that they were kind of considering and things that they had experienced. And some of the feedback that we got from folks was that there was a real lack of initiative from non-folks who weren't a part of communities that were historically oppressed to try to engage, to try to interact, because they were fearful that they may not do it right, that they may do it wrong, that that other folks should or should not be a part of the conversation. There was just a lot of concerns, fear, and uncertainty. And again, those are all understandable. And we also have to be in a space and create a space where we are prioritizing and know that we have to do the work in order to engage folks and for folks to be a part of these conversations. And so that was something that continuously came out of this report, and it was a published report from the Center Against Survivor Agency and Justice, and it was called the Racial and Economic Equity Project. And like I said, it was a bit of a stagnation and folks just not wanting to act because of that fear. And so even if they're ideas, let's hear what they are, and then we can talk through them about what the pros and cons, how communities may not react to those. But if we don't start the conversation, then we don't move to action, right? And if we don't move to action, then we can't have people sustained. And so some of the feedback that we're hearing here is speaking engagements. I'm annually event focusing on cultural diversity, okay? Being intentional in our hiring practices, yes, that goes to organizational policy. Back to representation and trust. I think it really starts with us providers to look within ourselves. Yes, that is something that, that it is a big conversation piece about reflection as well as representation. And I used to work with a colleague here that said, no decisions about us without us. And that really speaks to the representation piece, is that we need to make sure that we have, as we're making decisions about people and about communities, that those communities are represented. Unpack and grow and better emphasize with marginalized populations we serve. 100%. I want to pull out that piece real quick on unpack and grow. This process and engaging communities, and specifically if folks do any racial equity work, we're always growing towards equity, is the way that I like to think about it. I don't see that as an endpoint. I see us as always growing and learning. And so I like this unpacking and growing and better empathize with marginalized populations we serve. Another comment, in my community, there's a limited representation of underrepresented and marginalized individuals at leadership, coalitions, and coalitions in general. What I have personally done is become a member of some of these coalitions. I'm of Latino background, learn about them, and then work to engage other members who are underrepresented. Yes. So bringing other people into the fold as well is a huge piece as well. I think that's a challenge when we're thinking about inclusivity and representation, is that we want to make sure that folks are being brought in, that we're also helping people up, right, and bringing people in versus excluding people out. All such great ideas. Berneta, do you want to add anything, or what are your thoughts? Are you ready to move on?
Yeah, so I mean, the way that we approach sustaining membership, and I try to make sure that folks are getting what they need out of the coalition, and I try not to be extractive, which is always kind of an easy problem to walk right into by accident, being a little bit extractive. So for instance, some of the organizations that work with us that are in our coalition are senior organizations. They literally work directly with seniors. And so I make it a point to offer them our other resources here at Georgia Watch. Would they like to have us come out and put on a workshop that's relevant to some sort of senior issue, whether it's medical bills or anything like that? And so it keeps them in sort of like engaged in our NITBAN coalition, what we call our Georgia Identity Theft and Cybercrime Coalition. But it also helps them understand that we're a partner beyond just that coalition. And it also keeps us from really siloing that one coalition. Because what I have found is that if you do not establish sort of a partnership that goes beyond just the work of that specific coalition, members will kind of drop off. They will start to see that maybe they've gotten what they need out of it and they can move on. Honestly, the coalition itself kind of stagnates because you had one task that you're working on and it's kind of done. So we just try to make sure that we kind of bring people who are in the coalition into the loop with all of our other organizational activities, and that we are going to them and basically making it clear to them that we're a resource for them to use, and for their community to use. So that's kind of the broad way that we've approached sustaining membership, and particularly with the senior organizations that we work closely with. One of them is a senior organization that is really centered in Southwest Atlanta, which is predominantly Black and lower income. And so that community is well served by a lot of our other materials outside of just identity theft. So we make a point to offer that, those resources.
And I just add in that the TCCD, like our actual core stat coalition, you know, we're a 7-month-old coalition, actually 8-month now, and it's a pretty newer coalition. And one of the things that I was reflecting upon as we were preparing for this webinar was that with respect to the membership and it's like sustainability, is that because it is such a newer coalition, I had a hard time thinking about what is like sustainability look like, because it is still pretty new, and I'm like, well, yeah, are we still new? Are we growing? Are we sustaining? Like those kind of conversations kept kind of percolating in my brain as we were thinking about and preparing for this webinar. One of the things that I thought about was the fact that we are trying to be proactive with respect to these initiatives and sustainability. So we created 4 different committees. One of them is a membership committee. One is a policy committee. I'm sorry, it's not membership, it's engagement committee, a policy committee, resources committee, and then a training committee. And so we wanted to, and I think this goes to your point, is we want to make sure that folks feel like they're getting something out of that, and continuing to receive from the coalition and not just give. And so when we created our membership engagement form, we want folks to select in and tell us what things that they want to be a part of and how they can be a part of something. So what kind of do they have the capacity to do? Is it just to receive information? Is it just to be a part of the listserv? And then kind of escalate up various different types of involvement. So let folks opt into what they can be a part of. And that way we're trying not to be as extractive, that people still feel like they're getting something, but also contributing, and that balance. You know, I think a lot of us in the nonprofit field, you know, our organizations are really centered on providing service, and so we always battle with like give, but also how are you receiving and growing? And so hopefully, you know, this is an initiative we're just about to kind of launch. Hopefully this will help folks feel like they can give, but also get. And it can be an opportunity for people to grow. So folks who might be on the ground advocates, to opt into being a part of, for example, the policy committee. And that's something that as we were talking about these pieces, that people get to opt in, that we want to be equitable in the way that we're not going to pick and choose who's going to be a part of which committee. People just get to choose. But that we're also thinking about inclusivity in that. And so one of the things that kind of stood out to me was this particular piece around kind of policy, in that we have kind of traditionally, you know, policy spaces are not traditionally occupied largely by folks of color or other folks from marginalized, you know, communities. And so that kind of was a real big piece for me to be like, I want to be mindful and I want to help uplift and bring in people specifically. I mean, all of the committees are obviously going to be accessible, but this was something that I was really attuned to be like, This is a little bit more, you know, because I occupy this space and I see that as an experience that I've had where I'm not working alongside other folks of color or other folks who may have experienced different forms of repression very often. And so that committee platform, the opting in, it being by choice, looking at it through an equity lens, an inclusivity lens, that's an initiative, right, that we're hoping to move forward that would be proactive in that way.
Yeah, and I will just add that a very good example of how we've kind of organically made some headway in terms of including more underrepresented community members and sustaining that membership. We have a separate project that's really focused on systemic barriers and identifying systemic barriers based on racism that are affecting Southwest Atlanta and Southwest Georgia. Black communities there, and particularly we're very focused on small businesses owned by legacy Black residents of those communities and how they're struggling. And you may or may not know that most Black-owned businesses have like one employee, and that's the owner, which is not a very sustainable model. So these are small businesses that are themselves extremely vulnerable to identity theft and cybercrime, as a matter of fact. And we saw sort of a natural connection between that project and this work. And so one of the first things we did was offer some small business workshops around protecting your small business from cybercrime and identity theft to these small Black-owned businesses in Southwest Atlanta. So we're just trying to make sure that with all the other work that we're doing that's focused on marginalized communities, that we are seeing the easy sort of like obvious connections between identity theft broadly and how it connects directly to these marginalized communities. And I was very happy to be able to bridge that gap with some of our cohort that works directly on small business communities and whatnot in Southwest Atlanta. So those are just some concrete ways that we're trying to do exactly this, sustain membership of marginalized folks. Mona, I will have you respond to a comment that I see in the chat box, which is, can you restate the 4 committees again? And then we can move on to the next one.
Sure. So the committees that we have proposed, and again, remember, this is all, as I mentioned, it's in process. There is a engagement committee, policy committee, resources committee, and training committee. And there's 4 committees were actually identified by the coalition members as the kind of primary priorities. And so in our needs survey, those things came out. And then also at the end of our kind of funded coalition, we conducted another conclusion survey to ask folks, like, have you gotten what you needed out of the coalition? Do you feel like the coalition is still in line and actively moving forward the mission? What are the things that you want to highlight and prioritize? And those were elevated topics. And so we made committees as a way to one, continue to ensure that folks would be have an opportunity to contribute outside of just receiving training. And also 2, because of sustainability of the coalition. I know we're talking about sustainability of membership, but the other piece I would just quickly add is that the coalition itself and the membership, the sustainability of the organization itself, because we are 4 partner organizations that are separate entities, we had to be very thoughtful about what our capacity is when we're not funded, because we are no longer funded, to sustain the coalition as the TCCD. We are all doing this work separately, but how do we continue to sustain the organization? And we thought that if we create committees and allow folks the opportunity to opt in to these separate committees, depending upon their priority, their wants, their needs, their growth, that this would be a way to really essentially create a community-driven coalition versus a partner coalition. And so that was one of the thought frames around why we decided to create the committees and then allow folks to opt in and then determine what their participation will be in each of those committees. Hope that answered that.
So have you ever overcome or worked around the pitfalls of maintaining and sustaining membership. I'm pretty sure we all have stories here, so definitely drop some comments into the poll EV. I will definitely, oops, we just lost our screen for a moment there. I can tell you for hours some of the pitfalls I've had to overcome, or I'm still trying to overcome in terms of sustaining membership and maintaining membership. It goes back to something I said earlier. Sometimes when you have a very well-defined goal that has sort of like tangible outcomes that you tie to it, once you've hit that, you kind of find yourself stalling as an organization, and folks kind of drop off because they're not sure what the next thing is. They're not sure what we're doing beyond that thing that we've achieved. So in our Knit Band Coalition, one of the main things that we kind of laid out as a tangible was creating an update of our scam and identity theft and cybercrime workshops, modules, so that folks around the state could, deliver these presentations to their communities. We did that, and we even had some workshops that we conducted. And then after that is kind of like, okay, what are we doing next? How are we sustaining this? And this is a moment where people start kind of dropping off. They're not as responsive to emails. And it can just take a moment to sort of regain a sense of why the coalition should even still, stay together and so forth beyond that. But I think the way to overcome that particular type of pitfall is to make sure that your purpose, your goal that you lay out is multi-layered. It's not just this one tangible deliverable. You have a sense of how, in our work, how this particular issue really ties in with the overarching issue of systemic barriers that are based on race and things of that nature. So because we don't silo any of our work, I have been able to really overcome this particular pitfall by just making it very clear to coalition members, like, this is ongoing. People of color and low-income communities are constantly going to be, targets of this kind of issue, because they're not necessarily going to be, not low-income tomorrow. So there's always going to be more work to do here, and we just need to make sure that we understand what the next step is. We've done this, so what should we do next? What can we do to build upon the work that we've already accomplished? So, struggling with some members trying to take control from lead agency and furthering their own agenda. Oh my goodness, I don't even know where to start with this. Now, I will happily say that this has not been a problem in our Knit Band Coalition, but in other coalitions, absolutely. This goes back again to making sure that everyone is getting something out of it. I think if you can define very clearly what individual members are going to get out of the coalition, you can semi-prevent some of this sort of usurping of power and all that kind of stuff issue that always arises. But yeah, very, very solid point there. Any other comments? Like I said, I could talk about this for hours.
Someone also said,
do you have anything to add? Yeah, I was about to say, do you have anything to add? Because I know you do.
Oh, I was also just going to say that someone else added to the chat box and said lack of leadership support. So it seems like there might be some various levels of leadership, right? And that's a challenge. And I think that's always a challenge when it comes to not just organizations and structures, specifically. And I think that I would just say two things. Most organizations do have a very hierarchical structure, and I think that that's something a lot of organizations are going to run into. One thing that I would say is that, and this is, there's different philosophies of thought around this, so I want to just is that organizations can have hierarchical structures, right? And power sharing models. And so I would open up the thought and the consideration for folks with respect to coalitions and or even just broadly as organizations, that how you and your specific organization, or how you can in your coalition consider different power sharing models in a hierarchical framework. And so that's very kind of here, right? But what that might look like is you might come from a coalition that's one organization that leads it, but you might have those committees that really decide the priorities, that really decide the mission statement, that really decide the values of the coalition, and those things are all decided on together in a consensus base. And so that's one way that you may be able to alleviate some of the struggle within coalitions or even single agencies with the power, kind of the power struggle. It may not work for all organizations, and I will say this, that in my outside kind of racial equity work, that is a real hard conversation to have, especially if you are a person coming from a marginalized community and trying to challenge a traditional hierarchy structure where the dominant power may be coming from a, not from a community of color or marginalized community. And so that is a very real and struggle. And I don't want to minimize that, but that may be a conversation that could be had broader at the coalition and amongst the whole coalition about how can we come to more consensus-based decision-making and prioritization of the goals of the coalition. And I think that that's an option or a strategy that might be considered, again, across coalitions. There are lots of folks who are doing work around kind of shared power models. I'd have to look up some, and we can probably follow up with a kind of an insert or some information with resources. But there's definitely a lot of organizational work, and it's related to organizational culture that might be helpful in that kind of atmosphere. Did you want to add?
Yeah, I definitely think it goes back to something you said earlier, like figuring out when you start having those kinds of leadership issues, sometimes it's about capacity too and the lack thereof. It's really, I think, an important moment to start thinking about just the structure of the coalition. And it goes back to what you said earlier in terms of like having committees. If your coalition at that point doesn't have committees set up, and I honestly think in the early part of a coalition, it's best to keep it as simple as possible. So you may not have coalition set up yet. But once you start encountering this particular, issue of leadership and all that sort of thing, it's time to start thinking about committees. Because the more of a defined role coalition members feel that they have, the more likely you will be able to at least overcome or avoid these kinds of leadership quarrels and leadership concerns. That would be my 2 cents. So I want to be cognizant of time. We have 10 minutes, and I would love for folks to be able to get in any sort of questions they have and so forth. So let's definitely keep it moving. And try to save a little bit of time. You want to take this question, Mona?
Sure. And then this is actually our last question. So we're doing, yeah. So tell us about a successful effort or an experience that you might have had with a underrepresented or marginalized community with respect to your organization and your coalition building. So when you have made efforts or tried an initiative and it's come out successfully, tell us about it. One of the things that we do, and we have spent a lot of time on today talking about, are the challenges, the barriers, but what are the wins, especially in policy work? You may not often get a lot of wins, and in specific economic policy work, you may not get a ton of wins often. But what does that look like? And when you have had the win and when you have had the success, what are some of those things that added to that? So chime in, let us know. We really, really, really do want to hear. There is no success. There's no too small of a success. Everything is a win, and we have to celebrate those things. Again, I'm just going to put my nonprofit hat on and say that in the nonprofit world, we don't do this very often. We don't praise ourselves enough when there are wins. And this is the time that we do need to, sing our praise and really congratulate each other on these wins, because often we are our own biggest critics and we don't celebrate ourselves enough. So let's see what those wins are. I saw someone earlier, and I'm going to pull this out as a win, say that their advocacy staff was much more diverse and they had several more bilingual staff. that's a win. You know, y'all are doing something right. And so what are those wins that you guys are experiencing? And what do they look like? And what do you think contributed to them? Let me see if we've got any folks in the chat box. I will share a quick win that I was just informed of today. One of our partners at the TCCD was able to secure a small grant to translate out one of our products from the NITBAN grant, which was a financial abuse website. And it's, again, looking specifically at the intersection of coerced debt acquired by victims of domestic violence and in an identity theft situation. And so there was a toolkit that was created. It's an online, and it's currently available at www.financialabusehelp.org. And the grant it's in English right now, but the grant was secured in order to be able to translate that into Spanish. And that was the priority language that was identified by our, coalition as a need, especially specifically here in Texas. And so, that's a big win for us, because that means we'll be able to engage and to interact as a coalition with a broader stakeholder group that largely didn't have access to this before. And so that was a bit of a big win for us. We've got community outreach coordinator has built a very successful Chasing the Dragons presentation and panel, so much so that the school districts now reach out to her before she has the opportunity to reach out to them. Yes, in demand, I love it. With overdose rates soaring in the areas we cover, it's critical to get the information out there. That's always a good sign that when people are coming to you, that you are needed and you are able to support them. Wonderful, wonderful. More wins, more W's, more successful experiences. Again, there's no success that's too small. Well, I might open it up. Berneta, do you want to anything to share to contribute, or would you like for us to open it up broadly to the group for any additional questions?
Yeah, I just want to make sure everyone has time to get their sort of 2 cents in. So I will withhold my comment, and definitely let's open it up to the group. And I do see we have one poll EV response here.
Here we go.
Yeah, a couple more coming in.
Oh, okay, perfect. So ability to partner with Domestic Violence Coalition and providing providing training to law enforcement through case prosecution. Yes, wonderful. And as folks are also telling us about their wins, if you have any questions for us, please go ahead and type that into the chat box too, and we'll read them out loud and use the remaining time to also highlight the successes as well as answer any questions that folks might have.
And for the attendees out there, if you have questions, like Mona said, you can type them in the chat box. You should be able to pull it up. It should be toward the bottom of your screen. There's a chat. There's also a Q&A. You can type things there, and I can read them to the presenters. Up to you guys. But yeah, if there's any questions, please do type them in now. I don't see anything coming in, which could be a great sign that we've covered anything people would want to know. But I know that you guys, and I don't want to cut you off too quickly, but I do know that on the next slide you guys have contact information so that people can reach out to you if they do have questions later on. You guys can always reach out to me as well. I'm happy to put you in touch with the presenters. Like I said, my name's Laura. I work with the National Center for Victims of Crime. And there's Mona's and Berneta's contact information on your screen. So with that, And if you, Mona, Berneta, if you guys have any closing comments, please feel free, but I'll take this opportunity to thank our attendees for being with us today and to thank you, Berneta and Mona, for putting together this presentation series. I find it really, really interesting and really valuable, something that I don't see a lot. So I'd really love to do more of this in the future, see more of these types of discussions happening, whether they be online or in person. So thank you so, so much, and I'll turn it over to you guys for last remarks if you have any.
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone for joining and for listening in and sharing their really insightful experiences and thoughts on this issue. I do want to just emphasize that I'm easily accessible at that email address. So if you have any follow-up questions or thoughts and things like that, there's so much that we could have discussed that we just didn't have time to discuss. But if you have any extra comments and follow-up thoughts, please don't hesitate to email me.
I would just echo y'all, and my contact information is at the bottom as well. And I welcome any questions or contact or opportunity to chat with people.
All right, well, thanks so much, everybody. Attendees, panels alike for joining us today, and hope everyone has a good day, great rest of the week.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.